Good morning. I hope you found yesterday's introduction to be illuminating. As we've seen, Bibles come in many forms: papyrus rolls and handwritten codices, printed books, and online versions. Paying attention to these forms can teach us a lot about how Bibles are read and interpreted and by whom. We saw that the early manuscripts had no punctuation and word division, so reading was a really highly trained skill. In many times and places, Bibles were expensive and relatively rare, perhaps confined mostly to churches or monasteries, while in other times and places, Bibles are inexpensive and widely distributed. Part of that distribution has been through translation into hundreds of languages. Translation, of course, always requires interpretation. It also signals movement into new cultural domains where it takes on new forms of life. Paratextual materials, that is, chapter and verse numbers, headings, notes, introductory materials, maps, and their like. These also work to supply frameworks for interpretation. So what this means is that before a person even starts to read a Bible, the actual physical object communicates a lot about its contents, as well as about its potential readers and its interpretive possibilities. Today we're going to focus on one group of works in the New Testament. Now, although many books were written about Jesus and his teachings, all Bibles contain 4 separate accounts of his life and teachings called Gospels. Jesus himself did not write anything, but stories and teachings about him circulated orally. Some of these were eventually written down in the decades after his death. The 4 Gospels that are in the New Testament have much in common, especially in their narratives of the final days of his life. To scholars, these similarities suggest some kind of direct literary relationship. And yet, they are also distinctive in many points of content and theological emphasis. The Gospel of John does not appear to know the other 3 Gospels, and is written in a quite different style with its own theological perspectives. The other 3 have much more in common, sometimes word-for-word parallels. Now, in accounting for these similarities and differences, scholars consider the Gospel of Mark to be the earliest written gospel, perhaps written down sometime around 60 to 70 CE, that is to say, 60 to 70 AD. The writers of the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke apparently knew the Gospel of Mark, and they drew on it for much of their accounts. These 2 Gospels, that is, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, also include a large set of materials that were apparently unknown to the Gospel of Mark, as well as some other stories and teachings that are unique to each. So to get some sense of what I'm talking about, let's start by reading the beginnings of all 4 Gospels.